Good morning, boys and squirrels, and welcome back to my channel. So as promised, today's video is going to be all about the home decor trends throughout the decades. I wanted to make this video so that you guys have a starting point for when you start to do research on the vintage items that you're finding at the thrift stores. This will kind of give you like a general direction to look in or go in. So hopefully, once you know these styles, that will be helpful in finding out what decade your home decor item is from. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Now, normally I would start with the 1950s because 40s and before is rare to find those items. So I'm going to be focusing on the most common decades. So from the 1950s to the 1990s, but I'm going to start in the 90s because this is the most common decade of home decor that you're going to find in the thrift store. Also, I'm only going to be talking in terms of smaller items that are shippable that I think the average seller might pick up. I'm not going to be touching on furniture or carpeting or just the overall style of houses because it's not relevant. So if you want a video on vintage furniture, let me know and I will do my research and make that video for you guys. But for now, we're just going to be simply talking about home decor items. So in the 1990s, wicker and rattan was huge. So all these wicker baskets that you're finding or things made out of wicker or rattan are most likely from the 90s. Yes, wicker was big in the 70s as well, but it was mainly furniture that was made out of wicker, not accessories. So wicker and rattan, most likely 90s. The go-to neutral color in the 90s was brown and beige. Gray didn't come into the picture until the early 2000s, so the main neutral tone from the 90s, even to before the 90s, was typically brown or beige. One trend that was big that we actually talked about in Wednesday's video was celestial print. The suns, the moons, the stars, a lot of the decor, the suns were very elaborate. They had a face on them as well as the crescent moons. This was showing up in art, in clothing, in ceramic pieces, in little wooden boxes. It was everywhere and it's definitely coming back, so keep an eye out for celestial print. I hope I'm saying this right. I know somebody will correct me if I'm not. Damask print. Once you see it, you know what it is. It was kind of like a nod maybe to Victorian era almost. It looked very elegant. It was the 90s way of being elegant, basically, and it's very, very common on bedding in the 1990s. Another huge trend was the old world trend. So this is where the farmhouse trend started, was in the 90s. They were, doing a huge nod to primitive age, and this was mainly in the kitchen, so it's faux age stuff, stuff that looks rustic. Copper was huge. Again, the farmhouse vibe, and then color that they call French blue. And again, it's a nod to farmhouse style, but this is more of a nod to European and French farmhouse style. Another big trend in the 90s was wrought iron, which yes, is in furniture, but there are some decor pieces like lamps or even wall art that are made out of wrought iron. So let's get into the 1980s, which can be described by one color and one color only. Mauve. Everything was mauve. I don't know why, it had a moment. Mauve was the 80s, and the 80s was mauve. So fun fact, this was largely attributed to Georgia O'Keeffe's death. If you don't know who she is, she's a famous artist slash painter. She died in 1986, so her work became very popular. Now, her work depicted desert scenes and sunsets, so it had a lot of those mauve tones. This is also where the desert and adobe trend came into play in the 80s. So anything that you see that's like kind of southwestern, kind of deserty, this is when cactuses first started becoming popular, was in the 80s. Just a generalization of the colors of the 1980s was pastels. Pastels were huge in the 80s. Everything was a muted pastel tone. Another trend that was very popular in the furniture side of things was acrylic. I know I wasn't going to talk about furniture, but acrylic was huge in the 80s. And you can also see, I've found like little swans made out of the clear acrylic material. So just keep an eye out for that. If it's clear acrylic, most likely it's 80s. Metal wall sculptures. These big, elaborate sculptures made out of metal. It's self-explanatory. Metal wall sculptures. Tropical prints, which is a huge thing coming back now with the palm leaf wallpaper and all of that. That actually originated in the 80s. My favorite, which is brass. Now this was very common in hardware as well as home decor. So like cabinet knobs, drawer pulls, and then also just like figurines, stuff like that. I've actually got this little guy right here, little brass guy. Most likely 80s. Last but not least in the 80s is novelty phones. I don't even know how to describe these. Obviously, this was in a time where landlines were still in the picture. Disney used to make these phones. They would look like Mickey Mouse and like his ears would come off and it would be the phone. It was very odd and kind of morbid, but they made a ton of them. So if you do come across them, they're most likely 80s, even into the 90s. Alrighty, kids. Get ready. We're moving on to the 70s. Let's start off with color. Color is probably the number one tip-off that something is from the 70s. Those colors are Harvest Gold. Can you see I'm nodding to the 70s today? With my little jumpsuit. Avocado green, rust orange, and brown. Lots of brown. Something that was just as big as those colors is mushrooms. Mushroom print. Can we say hippies? I've seen this on plates and platters and cookie jars and all kinds of stuff, even like fabric wall hangings and art. Also, crewel work was huge in the 70s. I find a lot of it at the thrift store, and you probably do too, and you just probably didn't know what it was called. This is called crewel work. And again, it's usually in those 70s tones. Pyrex blew up in the 70s. Pyrex was actually originally started in 1915, but it didn't really catch fire until the 1970s. It made cooking more elegant for people. It wasn't just your typical like tin pan. So people really got into Pyrex in the 70s and also the 50s. Woven wall art. Those big wall decor pieces that we all have in our house that we call bohemian. Started in the 70s. Macrame plant holders, those big macrame, they're kind of like chandeliers, but they hang down like they're real long, and they have seashells on them. 70s. Ceramics and porcelain, and I mean that in the sense of decor pieces, not necessarily like kitchenware, but decor pieces. Lamps and large vases and figures, and sculptures were ceramic or porcelain. Porcelain is very thin as opposed to ceramic, which is a little bit thicker and more durable. Floral print, we see floral print in every decade, but in the 70s it was groovy, it was psychedelic, it was all these crazy colors. One thing that you guys may not know is tile souvenirs. And I'll put a picture on the screen because I actually have one in my POSHMARK closet right now. But instead of getting like a shot glass or a keychain or something from wherever you were visiting, you would get a ceramic tile. It sounds odd, but it's like a kitchen tile. It's very odd. And in 70s kitchens, printed ceramic tile was very big, so maybe that's why it was big in the souvenir world. But the one specific one that I have is from the National Park at Yosemite. So I thought that was pretty interesting that tiles were popular souvenirs, and a lot of times people would frame them and put a little like hook on the back of them so they could be wall art. It's just something that's very strange, but I actually come across it a lot, so keep an eye out for that. Another thing from the 70s was trivet art. Again, it has to do with the ceramic tiles. It was either surrounded by iron or wood or something like that, and a lot of people would use them as wall decor. It's even featured in that 70s show. You can see it behind Kitty. She has a cast iron and tile little wall hanging. Last but certainly not least in the 70s, Afghan blankets. Do not pass up on Afghan blankets, especially if you think that they are vintage, because they can fetch a pretty penny. I have sold Afghan blankets on Etsy for up to $75, so keep an eye out for them. I feel like a lot of people overlook them, but some of the more, elaborate ones can fetch a pretty penny, so Afghans, definitely keep an eye out for those. Alright, so let's get into the 1960s. I would describe the 1960s as a very odd decade. It was a transitional kind of decade. The space age was definitely a huge thing in the 60s with the first walk on the moon and cartoons like the Jetsons. But it was also hippies and Woodstock and rock and roll and free love and all that. So that's why it was kind of an odd decade. The color scheme kind of changed in the middle. It started with avocado green and yellow, and then it ended with bright neon colors like tangerine and bright red and the color aqua. So it's very odd, but it's funny to me because it switches. So the late 60s is very reminiscent of the 50s, but the early 60s is very 70s. So it's like it's flipped. You see what I mean? It's weird. Anyways, lava lamps were big in the 60s. Lava lamps. I mean, need I say more? Yes, they were reproduced massively in the 1990s. If you grew up in the 90s like I did, you had a lava lamp, but it started in the 60s. So that's pretty much all I have to say about the 60s. I can't find a whole lot about the 60s other than it was kind of like a mismatch of the 50s and 70s. So the 60s is kind of tough. If anybody has any more information, please feel free to leave that down below. So let's end on a great note, which is the 50s. I love the 50s. I wish my house was like 50s style because I absolutely adore 50s style. Like we talked about in Wednesday's video, a lot of people refer to the 50s as retro and kitschy, and an example of kitsch is this little guy. Look at him. He's so cute. He's just cute. That's what kitschy means. It's like, it's cute and kind of obnoxious. But look at him. He's cute. He has a little fuzzy tail. This is actually real fur. They were out here just making things happen in the 50s. But he's so cute, little trash panda. I love him. So 1950s decor was heavily influenced by space exploration, technology. Again, with the 1960s, it was very space age influenced. Another huge influence was Scandinavian, what we refer to now, I guess, as minimalist, wood, clean lines, etc., etc. I think we all know what mid-century modern looks like. It was a very modern age. These clean lines, this more modern look was huge. Pastels like mint green, pale yellow, and even a light baby blue. But also, those colors were mixed with the contrast of modern colors like bright red, orange, vibrant yellow, bright blue, and even black and white. Now, the 50s is probably most known for the patterns and prints that it presented, which were very abstract. You'll see a lot of like the sunburst, that little burst, I forget what it's called, and I'll put it on the screen because it's escaping me right now. It's like a sunburst, but it has little dots on the end of the bursts. Am I making any sense? Probably not. That ever so popular boomerang shape. So this pattern and print that we see, the starburst print, the boomerang print, carries into pretty much everything. Glassware, fabrics, clocks, all of it. It all had a print. So in the 1950s is where we see lamps start to become decorative pieces. Lamps were no longer just used for practical reasons, they were used as decor pieces. So that was a huge thing. Also, in the 1950s, we start to see like the little hula girl lamp, which leads to the Hawaiian trend, the Polynesian trend in the 1950s. Alrighty, so that concludes home decor throughout the decades. We made it. I'm sweating and I need a nap. From the 1950s to the 1990s, that's your home decor scoop. I'm Christina, back to you. So I'm gonna go now. I hope you guys learned something from this video. If you guys know of any trends that I didn't speak on, because I'm sure I missed a ton, let me know down in the comments below. Any knowledge that you have about these decades and home decor, please let me know down in the comments below. Let us all know down in the comments below so that we can continue to learn and grow. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure and give it a thumbs up on your way out. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and join our family. We would love to have you. I put new videos out every Wednesday and Friday, and I will see you guys on Wednesday. Bye, guys.